Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. In this episode, we are going to think about Nathan Nobis's article, Cultural Relativism. Do cultural norms make actions right and wrong? So the main view being analyzed in this article is an ethical theory known as cultural relativism. According to that ethical theory, what is ethically right and wrong is relative to or depends on cultural beliefs and attitudes. So if most people in a culture disapprove of an action, then that action is wrong for people in that culture. If a culture approves of an action, then that action is not wrong in that culture. All right, now it's important to be clear what we're talking about here. We're talking about rightness and wrongness themselves. That's what cultural relativism is a theory about. It is not the empirical observation, accepted as true by everyone, that different cultures sometimes have different ethical views, or that what people believe or think or feel about morality is sometimes relative to the culture they're in. It's an undeniable fact that what people believe, think, or feel about morality depends on their culture. Cultural relativism says something much stronger than that, more philosophically interesting than that. It says that rightness and wrongness themselves depend on cultural norms. All right, so Nobis offers what are called the implications of cultural relativism and asks us to think about these. All right, so an implication of a philosophical theory is just a claim about what follows from the theory, what logically follows from the theory. All right, so if the theory is true, then the implication must also be true. That's the idea. And Nobis discusses 4 implications of cultural relativism. These are important to consider if you want to know, is the theory actually true? Right? This is one way to test out a theory. What are its implications? Are they likely to be true, or do they seem obviously false? All right, first implication. The majority view on any moral issue is always correct no matter what. All right, does that seem likely? We could think about various kinds of behavior or action. So take slavery, for instance, in the American South in the early 1800s. The majority of people in the culture at the time thought that slavery was okay. Right? They approved of the practice of slavery. So does that make slavery okay in the American South in the early 1800s? Well, according to cultural relativism, yes, it does. That was the majority view on that specific moral issue. So that view was correct in the American South, no matter what. All right, you might wonder about this implication. Can something be really morally right just because most people in a culture approve of it? Second implication of cultural relativism is this. People who criticize majority views and advocate for change are always wrong. So social reformers are always wrong. So take a civil rights activist from the 1960s in the U.S. Rosa Parks decides to sit on the bus in an area of the bus where she's not supposed to sit, given her race. Right, so this is an act of civil disobedience. Could a social reformer like Rosa Parks potentially have been in the right when the rest of society, or the majority of society, was wrong? Is that possible? Well, it's not possible according to cultural relativism, because that view holds that the majority opinion in society determines what's right and what's wrong in that society. So the implication here is that a social reformer is going to be, by definition, mistaken if cultural relativism is true. All right, third implication. What's ethically right and wrong can just be identified by opinion polls. So if you want to know, for example, is it okay to have an abortion? Well, if you're asking the question here in the US, all you have to do to find out what the true answer is to that question is give out a survey and figure out what most people approve of or disapprove of in the US. And if it turns out that most people approve of abortion, well, then there's nothing wrong with getting an abortion. Alternatively, if most people happen to disapprove of abortion, well, then getting an abortion is wrong here in the US. Right? So that seems to be a way of answering moral questions that's just way too easy, right? If you want to know whether this or that thing is right or wrong, all you have to do is figure out what most people in your culture think. All right, the fourth implication of cultural relativism is that there can only ever be cultural change. There can never be progress or improvement. So the Emancipation Proclamation could not count as moral progress if cultural relativism is true. Because in order to have moral progress, there has to be some kind of objective yardstick or measure that you could apply to two different ways of doing things, namely having slavery or not having slavery, having a society where women can vote, having a society where women can't vote. Was it moral progress to give women the right to vote or to own property? Was it moral progress to give people of color the right to vote and to own property? If cultural relativism is true, these events would just be changes in our system. They're not necessarily progress at all. They can't be progress, according to this theory. All right, so Nobis suggests that these implications seem to show that relativism is false as a theory. Since the majority isn't always right, cultural critics are sometimes correct, opinion polls don't tell us what's really right and wrong, and cultural views really can improve and also become worse over time. All right, what are some arguments for cultural relativism? So Nobis gives us two. One is called the tolerance argument, and the tolerance argument goes like this. We should be tolerant and accepting of cultural differences, therefore cultural relativism is true. Right? But this is not a good argument. One problem with this argument is that no culture holds that we should tolerate and accept everything. So a principle of universal tolerance and acceptance would contradict relativism. If we thought that we should be tolerant and accepting of everything, then that would be to reject relativism, because that would be to accept a universal principle. Everyone should be tolerant and accepting of everything. Right? That idea might end up being self-defeating. The other argument that Nobis discusses is the argument from disagreement. So according to this argument, everyone observes that there are some profound ethical disagreements between cultures, so cultural relativism is true. This also isn't a good argument, though. Right? One problem for this argument is that when there are disagreements on an issue, what does that mean? It means that at most one side can be correct. Right? If one person believes Earth is round, another person believes Earth is flat, they have a genuine disagreement, so they can't both be correct. But it doesn't mean that neither of them can be correct. It doesn't mean that there's no fact of the matter just because they disagree. So the premise of this argument seems to provide no evidence at all for thinking that cultural relativism is true. Moreover, you might think that this argument is self-defeating because there are some profound ethical disagreements between philosophers over whether cultural relativism is true. And so if disagreement about a topic means that there is no objective truth about that topic, then cultural relativism itself could not be objectively true. All right, you might be wondering at this point, if morality isn't grounded in cultural norms, then what else might it be grounded in? Right? So if cultural norms don't explain what makes an action right or wrong, then what does? There are many alternatives. The main alternative to cultural relativism is a theory of moral truth called moral objectivism, which says that there are some universal, objective moral truths. And there are many different ethical theories that explain morality in different ways. So there are theories that explain rightness in terms of what maximizes happiness for creatures like humans and potentially animals who can have good and bad experiences. There are theories that explain moral rightness in terms of universal moral principles or rules that we should all follow all of the time. And so over the next couple videos, we're going to take a look at what some of these theories are and think about which, if any of them, might be true.